There was a night in the early 1980s when Rudolf Schenker locked himself away with an acoustic guitar and began writing a song about the one thing he never talked about in public: the death of his own marriage. The door was shut, the lights were low. Outside that room existed tour buses, screaming crowds, and a career that seemed to be climbing without limit. But inside, it was just him, a guitar, and a silence he did not know how to fill any other way. Nobody in his band knew what he was carrying. Nobody in the world knew. And what he wrote that night would sit hidden for years, almost lost, before it became one of the most beloved rock ballads ever recorded. To understand why a founding member of Scorpions, a band built on leather, sweat, and screaming guitars, would risk everything on a song about a broken heart, you have to go back to a life that looked perfect from the outside and was quietly falling apart on the inside. By 1980, Scorpions were no longer just a German rock band clawing for attention. They were selling out arenas across Europe, breaking into America, riding the wave of Love Drive and Animal Magnetism, records that had turned 5 scrappy musicians from Hanover into a global rock machine. Rudolf Schenker stood at the center of it, rhythm guitarist, founder, the steady hand who had built this band from nothing since 1965. On stage, he was fire, sprinting the length of the boards, guitar slung low, sweat flying under the lights, while thousands screamed his name back at him. Offstage, at home, in the quiet hours after the amplifiers went cold, something in his life was cracking. His marriage, the one that had grounded him through years of touring, broken hotel rooms, and endless nights on the road, was ending. And he was carrying that weight completely alone, folding it small enough to hide inside his jacket pocket every time he stepped in front of a microphone. The rest of the world only saw the version of Rudolf Schenker built for magazine covers, the guitarist grinning under stage lights, sprinting across arena floors, driving the band's sound with that unmistakable rhythm attack. Fans saw a man who never seemed to tire, who threw himself into every note like the stage was the only place he needed to be. His bandmates saw a disciplined professional who rarely canceled a rehearsal, rarely showed weakness, rarely let anyone see him rattled, the one who showed up early and left late, always in control. That was the image, and Rudolf protected it fiercely, because in a band that thrived on invincibility, cracks were not supposed to show. Rock stars of that era did not talk about failing marriages. They did not admit to lying awake at 3 a.m. in some anonymous hotel room, staring at a ceiling fan, replaying the same argument on a loop, wondering where the years had gone and at what exact point the two of them had stopped reaching for each other. So when his marriage began to unravel, somewhere between endless tours and mounting distance, between phone calls that grew shorter and letters that grew rarer, Rudolf did what he had always done with pain he could not say out loud. He turned to his guitar. Not the electric monster he used to level festival crowds, not the instrument built for volume and spectacle, but a simple acoustic, the kind of instrument that forces a musician to be honest because there is nowhere to hide behind distortion, nowhere to disappear into a wall of sound. Friends close to the band later said Rudolf became quieter during this stretch, more withdrawn between shows, disappearing to hotel rooms instead of joining the others for a drink or a late meal after a gig. Nobody pushed him to explain. That was not how these men operated, not in a world where toughness was currency. But something was clearly moving inside him, coiling tighter with every silent night, and it was about to come out in 6 minutes of melody that no one saw coming. The night it happened, Rudolf was alone, guitar resting across his knee, fingers finding their way almost without thought, and he began picking out a chord progression that felt different from anything he had written before. No aggression in it, no power chords built for a wall of Marshall amplifiers, no riffs engineered to detonate in front of 40,000 people. Just a slow, aching melody, the kind that seems to breathe instead of strike, rising and falling like something exhaling after holding its breath too long. He has since described writing it almost like a confession he could not say to another human being, so he set it to 6 strings instead, letting the guitar carry words he could not yet find. He was not thinking about hit singles or album track lists. He was thinking about a woman he had once promised forever to, about the silence that now sat where love used to be, thick and immovable, about the strange guilt of a man who spends his life being loved by strangers in stadiums, while the one relationship that mattered most quietly slips away in the spaces between tour dates. The melody that emerged was tender, almost fragile, built around a rising phrase that felt like someone reaching out a hand, hoping it would be taken, hoping it was not already too late. He played it over and over that night, refining it note by note, living inside it, feeling something loosen in his chest each time the phrase resolved. There were no words yet, just that melody, raw and unmistakably personal, more personal than anything he had ever let another person hear. When he finally set the guitar down, hours later, his fingertips sore, he knew he had written something real. He also knew, almost instantly, that it terrified him. This was not a song for scorpions, he told himself, packing the feeling away even as the melody kept circling in his head. This was too soft, too exposed, too much like tearing open his own chest in front of 4 other men who had built their identity on being untouchable. For a long time, Rudolf kept the melody to himself. He would hum it quietly during sound checks, play fragments of it backstage when he thought no one was listening, fingers drifting to those same 6 notes almost involuntarily, then stop the moment someone walked in, snapping back into the guitarist the world expected to see. The fear was not that the song was bad. He knew, somewhere underneath the anxiety, that it was good, maybe better than good. The fear was that it was too honest. Scorpions in the early 1980s had a reputation to protect. Denim, leather, blistering guitar solos, songs about rebellion and chaos. Not confessions about a marriage falling apart. Not something that sounded like weeping set to music. Rudolf worried that if he brought this melody to Klaus Meine and the others, they would hear exactly what it was, a man quietly breaking, and he was not ready for his bandmates to see that side of him, not ready to hand them the one unguarded piece of himself he had left. So instead of sharing it right away, he buried it. He kept the tape, kept the memory of that night pressed somewhere private, and moved on with the business of being a rock star, throwing himself into the punishing schedule of touring behind animal magnetism, into hotel check-ins and sound checks and interviews that asked about everything except the thing actually consuming him, work that left little room to sit with his own sadness, even when it followed him onto every stage. But melodies like that do not disappear. They wait, patient and stubborn, humming under the surface of a life that kept moving forward without them. And this one waited for years, tucked away while the band recorded an entire other album around it, one that almost never made room for the song at all. That next album was 1982's Blackout, a record built on speed and aggression, on Klaus Meine fighting through vocal cord surgery just to sing it into existence, forcing sound out of a throat that doctors had warned might never fully recover. There was no space on Blackout for a tender acoustic confession, and frankly, Rudolf still was not ready to offer it up, still flinched at the thought of playing it for anyone. He has said in later interviews that the melody sat in his back pocket for what felt like an eternity, played occasionally in private moments, always pulled back before it could go any further. A secret he kept returning to, and kept retreating from in the same breath. Some ideas get finished in a week. This one took years, not because the melody was unfinished, but because the man who wrote it was not ready to let it be heard, was not ready to admit out loud what it meant. Meanwhile, his marriage finished collapsing entirely during this stretch, the divorce becoming real, becoming final, papers signed in rooms far away from any stage, becoming the quiet backdrop to a band that was, to the outside world, riding higher than ever. Interviewers asked about tour dates and album sales, about the new record's blistering pace, and Klaus's remarkable recovery. Nobody asked Rudolf Schenker how he was actually doing, and he never volunteered it, answering every question with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to hide. The song remained his secret, a private grief set to music, waiting for a moment he could not yet see coming, a moment when the timing, the band, and the courage would finally align. That moment arrived as Scorpions began shaping what would become Love at First Sting. Sometime during pre-production, Rudolf finally played the melody for Klaus Meine, the band's voice and chief lyricist. Picture that moment carefully, because it mattered enormously. Rudolf, the man who almost never showed vulnerability, sitting across from Klaus with an acoustic guitar, hands maybe trembling slightly as he found the opening notes, playing a melody he had protected for years, watching Klaus's face as the notes unfolded, searching for any flicker of judgment or surprise. Klaus did not hear a weakness. He heard something the band had never had before, a song that could reach past the leather jacket crowd and touch anyone who had ever loved someone and lost them. A song that stripped away every ounce of armor Scorpions usually performed behind. Klaus took the melody and began shaping lyrics around it. Not a literal retelling of Rudolf's divorce, but something wider, a universal ache anyone could pour their own heartbreak into, careful never to name names or specific wounds. Lines about promises, about someone insisting they were still loving you, despite everything falling apart. About holding on to a feeling, even after the facts of a relationship had already ended. Klaus has spoken about wanting the words to feel like they belonged to every listener, not just to the man who wrote the music. About laboring over phrases until they felt universal rather than confessional. It was a delicate balance, honoring Rudolf's private pain while turning it into something the whole world could claim as their own. And Klaus rewrote it more than once, refusing to let a single wrong word cheapen what Rudolf had handed him. The song came fully to life inside Dierks' studio, the legendary producer who had shaped nearly every Scorpions record since the 1970s, a man with an ear for exactly when a song needed silence and when it needed thunder. Dierks understood immediately that this track needed to be treated differently from anything else on the album. He built the arrangement slowly, patiently, letting the acoustic guitar breathe before the band layered in drums, bass, and eventually Matthias Jabs's guitar solo, a soaring, aching centerpiece that gave the ballad its emotional payoff. Each note stretched and bent like it was reaching for something just out of reach. In the studio, engineers noted how seriously the band took this particular track. Far more takes, far more attention to dynamics than a typical rocker demanded. Hours spent adjusting a single reverb tail or the exact swell of a string section until it felt inevitable rather than arranged. Rudolf has described hearing the finished arrangement for the first time and feeling something close to disbelief sitting in the control room as the strings and Matthias's solo washed over the melody he had written alone in a locked room years earlier. That his private confession, the one he had been too afraid to even share, was now being built into a towering piece of music by the entire band. It no longer felt like his secret alone. It felt like something bigger than him, something that might actually matter to people he would never meet, something that had outgrown the pain it was born from. Still, releasing it was a gamble almost nobody in the Scorpions camp was fully comfortable with. Love at First Sting was shaping up to be a hard rock record, muscular, sexually charged, built around the provocative cover art that would define the album's image and its marketing. Dropping a slow, vulnerable ballad into the middle of that identity felt risky, almost contradictory, like slipping a love letter into a leather jacket pocket. Record executives worried it would confuse fans, expecting more blackout-style aggression, worried it would puncture the very image the label was spending so much to build. Some, close to the band, questioned whether the song was simply too soft, too much of a departure, too far from the sound that had made Scorpions a name worth chanting in stadiums. But Klaus and Rudolf both believed in it, refusing to let the song be buried the way it had almost been buried once already, and the band made the decision to include it, then eventually to release it as a single, betting that raw honesty would outweigh any risk to their tough image. It was, in its own way, Rudolf finally choosing to let the world see the wound he had spent years hiding, deciding that the song deserved more than a life confined to hotel rooms and empty rehearsal spaces. The gamble paid off beyond anything they imagined. Still Loving You became a phenomenon, especially across Europe, where it lodged itself on the French charts for what felt like forever, turning into one of the best-selling singles in that country's history, played on radios in cafes and cars from Paris to Marseille. Fans who had never cared about hard rock found themselves moved by this song, played at weddings, whispered along to at concerts by people wiping away tears they did not expect to cry. Strangers, who had never heard of Blackout or Animal Magnetism, suddenly humming a melody born in a locked hotel room years before. Scorpions, a band defined by volume and spectacle, had reached people through 6 minutes of aching tenderness born from one man's private collapse, proof that the softest thing he had ever made turned out to be the most enduring. Rudolf Schenker's marriage did not survive. But the song that grew out of its ending has outlived every headline about it, still played today, still requested, still carrying inside it a truth its writer once thought was too painful to ever let anyone hear.